The Decembrist Revolt of 1825 was a pivotal event in Russian history, representing the first significant attempt to overthrow the autocratic monarchy of the Romanov dynasty. The revolt, although ultimately unsuccessful, was a precursor to future revolutionary movements in Russia. Here's a complete history of the Decembrist Revolt.
Background.
In the early 19th century, Russia was under the rule of Tsar Alexander I, who had been seen as a somewhat reform-minded ruler. However, after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, Alexander I became more conservative, distancing himself from liberal reforms. The rigid autocratic system of government continued to suppress any push for democratic changes. Several factors contributed to the revolt. Napoleonic Wars and exposure to liberal ideas. Many Russian officers who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, were exposed to liberal and constitutional ideas in Europe, particularly in France. These ideas, such as constitutionalism and individual rights, began to take root among a growing number of military officers. Social and political climate. Russia was an agrarian society with widespread serfdom, which treated peasants as little more than property. The growing discontent among the nobility and military officers about the lack of reforms in Russian society further fueled these ideas. The death of Alexander I. In 1825, Tsar Alexander I died unexpectedly. His death triggered a power struggle. His heir, Nicholas I, was not well liked by many in the military and nobility. Many officers hoped for a more reformist ruler and began to organize. The secret societies. The most prominent groups behind the revolt were the Decembrists, military officers who had formed secret societies aimed at promoting constitutional reforms. The two main secret societies were the Northern Society, which advocated for a constitutional monarchy and the abolition of serfdom. The Southern Society, which had more radical ideas, including the establishment of a republic. The revolt. The Decembrist Revolt occurred on December 14, 1825, December 26, according to the Gregorian calendar. It unfolded in the context of the death of Alexander I and the succession crisis that followed. The two Tsars. The revolt was triggered by confusion over who would succeed the throne. Nicholas I, the younger brother of Alexander I, was to ascend the throne, but some members of the military believed his reign would be a return to autocracy and a setback for reform. The Decembrists, who supported the more liberal ideas of constitutional monarchy or even a republic, believed they could press their demands by acting quickly. The military's role. Many of the conspirators were military officers. On the day of the revolt, about 3,000 soldiers from the elite Pavlovsky, Semyonovsky, and Preobrazhensky regiments gathered in Senate Square in St. Petersburg to protest the ascension of Nicholas I. The Decembrists planned to demand that Nicholas I step down and that the reforms be implemented. The protest in Senate Square. The soldiers gathered in the square, holding a rally against the new Tsar. They refused to take an oath of loyalty to Nicholas I, demanding instead that Constantine, the older brother of Alexander I, take the throne. However, Constantine had already abdicated, and the revolt lacked clear leadership and coordination. Nicholas I's response. Tsar Nicholas I, determined to quell the revolt, ordered the troops to disperse. When the soldiers refused, Nicholas I gave the order for artillery to open fire on the protesters. The soldiers in Senate Square were met with cannon fire, which resulted in dozens of deaths and injuries. The revolt was crushed within hours. Aftermath. The trials and executions. Following the defeat of the revolt, the surviving leaders were arrested and put on trial. 5 of the Decembrist leaders were sentenced to death, including Pavel Pastel, the leader of the Southern Society. They were executed by hanging on July 13, 1826. Many others were exiled to Siberia. Nicholas I's reign. Nicholas I, having firmly secured his power, embarked on a policy of reactionary conservatism. He intensified censorship, suppressed liberal movements, and imposed a police state. His reign became notorious for its authoritarian nature, which would last until the reforms of the late 19th century. Impact on Russian society. Though the revolt was crushed, it left a lasting legacy. It highlighted the deep dissatisfaction within the Russian military and elite with autocratic rule. The Decembrists, in their attempt to reform Russia, also symbolized the conflict between liberal ideals and autocratic power. Their ideas and martyrdom became symbols for later revolutionary movements, particularly the Russian Revolution of 1917. Cultural impact. The Decembrist Revolt inspired poets, writers, and political thinkers. It became a key event in the Russian Romantic movement, symbolizing the struggle for freedom and reform against oppressive forces. Writers such as Alexander Pushkin and Fyodor Dostoevsky were influenced by the events of the revolt. Conclusion. The Decembrist Revolt of 1825, though unsuccessful in achieving its goals, was a significant moment in Russian history. It demonstrated the potential for resistance to autocratic rule and laid the groundwork for later revolutionary movements. While the revolt itself was a failure, its legacy endured as a symbol of the struggle for liberty and reform in Russia, influencing future generations who would seek to dismantle the Tsarist autocracy.